I just wanted to shoot hoops in my own driveway. A woman in a fake badge blocked my path. She called security, then police, then lies piled higher. My mother cried on the phone, begging her to stop. 2 months later, I stopped fighting back at all. Then my brother came home from deployment early. Turns out Deborah wasn't even the real HOA president. What happened at that emergency meeting changed everything. My name is Zoe Bennett, 17, and Ridgemont Estates in Marietta, Georgia has been my whole world since I was 8. Mom works double shifts as a nurse, and our house on Willow Court is small but ours, paid for with years of her overtime and my late father's life insurance. My older brother Marcus enlisted in the Army the same summer I started high school. We talk every Sunday when the time zones line up, and his letters from Fort Bragg and later overseas kept me steady through freshman year. He always signed off the same way, "Hold the fort." Zondag. Ridgemont was quiet, mostly retirees and young families, the kind of place with a community pool, a clubhouse, and a Facebook group full of lost cat posts. Nobody really knew who ran the HOA anymore since old Mr. Alvarez moved to Florida. That silence, I'd learn, was exactly the gap someone was waiting to fill. Deborah Whitfield moved into Ridgemont 2 years ago, 3 houses down from us, and within months she'd inserted herself into every committee meeting. She wore a lanyard with HOA Community Safety printed on it, though nobody remembered voting her into that role. People just assumed someone official had approved it. First, Deborah seemed helpful, almost eager. She organized a neighborhood watch text chain, delivered flyers about trash pickup schedules, and volunteered to handle noise complaints so the actual board wouldn't be bothered. Mom called her a busybody, but a harmless one. Harmless, we thought, was the operative word. The real HOA president, Mr. Alvarez, had resigned by mail 8 months earlier when he relocated to Sarasota. Nobody scheduled a proper election. Deborah simply started signing emails, acting HOA president. And when a few neighbors questioned it, she waved a stack of bylaws nobody had actually read. I noticed her watching our house sometimes from her porch, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. She'd note when Marcus's old truck sat in the driveway too long, or when our trash cans stayed out an extra day. Small comments, always delivered with a syrupy smile that never reached her eyes. Karen, that's not her real name, but that's what everyone in the group chat started calling her. Began issuing courtesy notices. Ours arrived weekly. Grass half an inch too tall. A wind chime violating quiet enjoyment. A wreath on our door in the wrong shade of green. Other families got notices too, but ours came more often, worded sharper, threats of fines tucked into every line. Mom paid what she could to avoid conflict, working extra shifts just to cover fees that, we'd later learn, had no legal basis whatsoever. Deborah wasn't authorized to fine anyone. I was 15 when it started, and I mostly stayed out of it, shooting free throws in our driveway after school, headphones in, minding my business. That driveway hoop became, without me realizing it, ground zero for everything that followed. Deborah hated the sound of the ball. She said so, often. Some of us are trying to enjoy peace and quiet, she told my mother once. Syrup sweet, eyes flicking toward me like I was a stray dog that had wandered onto her lawn. Mom just nodded and apologized. The way black mothers in majority-white subdivisions learn to apologize for existing. My best friend Priya lived 2 streets over, and even she noticed the pattern before I fully let myself see it. She doesn't do this to the Hendersons, Priya said one afternoon, watching Deborah photograph our recycling bin. Their kids leave bikes on the lawn constantly. She never says a word. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe Deborah was just uptight with everyone equally. Kids do that, explain away what adults refuse to name. It was easier than sitting with the alternative. Easier than admitting the woman 3 houses down looked at me like a problem to solve. Marcus called from overseas that spring. Video choppy. Background full of desert light. I mentioned Deborah in passing, laughing it off as the HOA lady who hates my basketball. His face changed. Just slightly. Document everything, he said. People like that always overreach eventually. Save it for when they do. I didn't understand then why my brother, thousands of miles away in uniform, took a nosy neighbor so seriously. Later I'd learn he'd seen versions of Deborah before, the kind of person who mistakes a lanyard for a badge and a badge for permission to control other people's lives. The HOA newsletter that summer featured a section called Community Spotlight, always some smiling white family's garden or holiday display. Our house never appeared, though Mom's rose bushes won a county fair ribbon that June. Small omissions. Just a pattern, quietly accumulating. Deborah started attending city council meetings too, introducing herself as Ridgemont's HOA president to officials who had no reason to doubt her. She built relationships with the local police liaison officer, a soft-spoken man named Deputy Reyes, chatting with him at every community event like they were old friends. I didn't know it yet, but Deborah was laying groundwork, establishing herself as the trustworthy voice of Ridgemont Estates long before she'd need that credibility for something worse. She collected favors, built a paper trail of her own, concerned for community safety, all while nobody signed a single official document. One October evening, Deborah knocked on our door holding a clipboard and a laminated badge that read, HOA Safety Officer, in bold gold letters. Mom later learned she'd ordered it online for $19. That night, though, it looked official enough that even I felt a flicker of unease. Just doing my rounds, Deborah said, peering past Mom into our living room like she had every right to inventory our furniture. She left a notice about our porch light being too bright for the neighborhood aesthetic. Mom shut the door quietly. I remember thinking, this woman is never going to stop. By Thanksgiving, 3 other families of color in Ridgemont had similar stories. Extra notices, extra scrutiny, extra suspicion. The Okafors got fined for a satellite dish identical to the Petersons, who got no fine at all. Nobody compared notes yet. Deborah made sure of that, keeping her targets isolated. I started keeping a mental list, the way you do when something feels wrong but you can't yet prove it. Every notice, every comment, every time Deborah's car slowed as it passed our house. I didn't know why I was keeping track. Some instinct told me I'd need it someday. Christmas came and went, and Marcus's deployment got extended another 6 months. Mom cried on the phone with him that night. Not about Deborah, just missing her son. I sat on the stairs listening, feeling the particular loneliness of a house with an empty chair at the table. January brought new HOA amendments, posted on the community bulletin board with Deborah's signature, restricting loitering on driveways after 6 p.m. and requiring proper attire in common areas. Vague enough to enforce selectively. Specific enough to feel aimed. I read it twice and felt my stomach tighten. Priya's mom, a lawyer, glanced at the amendment and frowned. HOAs can't just pass rules without a board vote and proper notice, she said. Has anyone actually seen the bylaws? Nobody had. Deborah always had an excuse. The documents were being updated, or with the printer, or simply unavailable. I brought this up once, gently, at a community potluck, asking Deborah where I could find the official bylaws. Her smile tightened. You're 17, she said. This isn't really your concern. The way she said sweetheart made my skin crawl. I never asked her anything directly again. Winter turned to spring, and I kept playing basketball in the driveway, headphones in, trying to hold onto something that felt normal. I didn't know yet that a single afternoon in April would turn Deborah's quiet campaign of notices into something loud, public, and impossible to ignore. It was an ordinary Tuesday in April when everything shifted. I was in the driveway after school, ball echoing against the backboard, when Deborah's SUV rolled up slow and stopped at the curb. She stepped out in that fake badge and sunglasses, phone already raised, recording before she said a word. You need to stop that racket immediately, she said. Voice pitched loud enough for the whole street to hear. I paused mid-dribble, confused. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. There was no rule against basketball at 4:15. I told her so, politely. Her jaw tightened like I'd slapped. I am the HOA safety officer, she announced, tapping her laminated badge. And I'm documenting a disturbance. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The badge looked like something from a Halloween costume shop. That laugh, I'd learn later, was the moment she decided I needed to be taught a lesson. She called someone right there on the sidewalk, voice suddenly trembling, performing distress for whoever was listening. There's a young man, a teenager, being aggressive with me in the street, she said. I stood frozen, ball still in my hands, watching her paint a picture of a scene that hadn't happened. I'm a girl. But something about how she described me over the phone, vague, threatening, deliberately unclear, made my stomach drop. A patrol car actually turned onto our street 12 minutes later. My hands started shaking before I even understood why. Deputy Reyes stepped out, recognized Deborah immediately, greeted her by name. He looked at me, 17, a basketball under my arm, my own driveway beneath my feet, and I watched confusion cross his face as the story didn't match the girl standing in front of him. Ma'am, this is a minor playing basketball at her own home, he said carefully. Deborah backpedaled fast, claiming she'd felt threatened by my tone, that I'd gotten in her face. None of it was true. Deputy Reyes wrote something in his notebook, thanked us both, and left without incident. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Deborah posted in the Ridgemont Facebook group about a concerning incident involving a teenager exhibiting aggressive behavior toward a community safety volunteer. She didn't name me, but everyone on that street knew exactly who she meant. Comments piled up fast. Some neighbors defended me immediately, Priya's mom included, but others, people who'd never spoken 2 words to me, wrote things like, kids these days have no respect, and glad someone's watching out for our safety. I read every comment. I couldn't stop myself. Mom came home from her shift to find me crying at the kitchen table. Laptop open. She read the post twice, her face going very still. The particular stillness I'd learned meant she was furious and trying not to show it in front of me. "We're documenting everything," she said quietly. She called Marcus that night despite the time difference, waking him in the middle of his own night. I heard her voice through the wall, careful and controlled, explaining what happened. When she hung up, she told me he'd said only one thing: "Don't apologize for anything." Not one thing. The next morning, a notice appeared taped to our front door. Not mailed. Taped. Like a warning. It cited aggressive conduct toward an HOA official and threatened further action if incidents continued. There was no incident. There was a girl playing basketball and a woman who'd decided otherwise. I stopped going outside after school. I told myself it was temporary, just until things calmed down. But I noticed myself flinching every time a car slowed near our house. Deborah's SUV passed by more often now, always at a crawl, always right around the time I used to shoot hoops. Priya started coming over instead, and we'd sit in my room with the shades half drawn, doing homework, pretending nothing had changed. But something had. Days in my head like evidence. What time I left the house. What I wore. Who saw me. Just in case. At school, word had somehow traveled, the way it does in small towns feeding into big high schools. A classmate asked if I'd really threatened some old lady. I explained what actually happened. He shrugged, unconvinced, already halfway to believing whatever version had reached him first. That stung more than expected. Mom filed a formal complaint with the actual county HOA oversight office, only to learn something strange. Ridgemont's HOA had no registered president on file since Mr. Alvarez's departure. No election records. Deborah Whitfield existed, officially, as nothing more than a resident with a homemade badge. That discovery should have ended things right there. Instead, Deborah doubled down, telling neighbors the county records were outdated paperwork, and that she'd been unanimously supported by the community at a meeting nobody remembered attending. She had an answer for everything, delivered with total, unshakable confidence. I started noticing small things about her explanations that didn't add up, dates that shifted depending on who asked. A community vote that supposedly happened on a Tuesday when the clubhouse had been closed for repairs. I mentioned this to Priya's mom, who told me to write it all down. Deputy Reyes came by our house one evening, off duty, out of uniform, which surprised us both. "I looked into some things," he said carefully, glancing back toward the street. "That badge she wears isn't issued by any agency. I keep a record of your interactions with her, just in case." That warning from an actual officer of the law felt like the first crack of validation in weeks of feeling gaslit by an entire street. Mom bought a small notebook that night and wrote Deborah Whitfield, incident log on the cover. We started dating every notice, every comment, every slowed car. 2 weeks later, Deborah announced at a hastily called emergency community meeting that Ridgemont needed a stricter code of conduct, citing recent troubling behavior from certain residents. She never said my name. She didn't have to. Toward where Mom and I sat, silent, together. A new proposal circulated. Mandatory ID checks for anyone using the community pool, who appeared unfamiliar. I'd swum in that pool since I was 8 years old. The proposal passed on a voice vote of maybe a dozen people, none of whom represented the actual homeowner majority of Ridgemont Estates. I stopped going to the pool that summer, the one place I'd always felt most like a kid instead of a suspect. Priya offered to come with me as backup, but I couldn't stomach the thought of Deborah's clipboard tracking my entrance, questioning whether I belonged in water I'd swum in for years. By early June, I understood something had shifted permanently. This wasn't going to blow over. Deborah wasn't going to lose interest and move on to some other target. And somewhere overseas, my brother's deployment clock kept ticking down, each day bringing him closer to a homecoming none of us could have predicted. In July, I broke my own rule and went to the pool with Priya on a scorching afternoon, desperate for relief from the heat. Deborah was there within minutes, clipboard in hand, demanding to see proof of residency despite my having lived in Ridgemont for 9 years. I had no ID on me. Rules are rules, she said, loud enough for the lifeguard and half a dozen sunbathing neighbors to hear. I stood dripping at the gate while she made a show of verifying my address on her phone, drawing out every second, making sure everyone watched a black teenager get interrogated at a pool. Priya's mother happened to be there and intervened immediately, calmly informing Deborah that residency verification wasn't a lifeguard's job, nor an HOA volunteer's authority. Deborah's smile flickered but held. "I'm simply protecting our community," she said, as if humiliating a 17-year-old constituted protection of anything at all. That night, I found an anonymous message in my inbox from an account I didn't recognize. She did this to a family in her old neighborhood too. Look up Fairview Commons, 2021. I stared at the message for a long time before showing Mom. Neither of us slept much that night. Mom searched online and found a local news archive, a small item about Fairview Commons HOA disputes. A resident named Deborah Whitfield accused of impersonating a security officer and harassing a Latino family until they moved. No charges filed. Just a quiet relocation, a fresh start, a new street. This wasn't Deborah's first target. This was a pattern, refined over years, moved from neighborhood to neighborhood like a traveling show. I felt something shift in my chest, somewhere between fear and fury. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how many times she'd gotten away with this exact thing. We printed the article and added it to Mom's notebook, now growing thick with dated entries, screenshots, and photocopies. I started to understand, slowly, what Marcus had meant months earlier about documenting everything. You don't fight someone like Deborah with anger. You fight her with a paper trail she can't talk around. Deborah, sensing scrutiny building, shifted tactics. Fake courtesy notices became real financial threats. An official-looking letter arrived citing an $800 fine for repeated violations, due within 30 days or a lien would be placed on our house. Mom's hands shook reading it. $800 we absolutely did not have spare. Priya's mother reviewed the letter and confirmed what we suspected. No legitimate HOA board had approved any fine schedule. And without a registered, elected board, Deborah had zero legal authority to levy fines at all. "This is fraud," she said plainly. "But proving it takes time, and time favors her." I called Marcus that week, and for the first time, I heard real anger in his voice, controlled but unmistakable. "She's threatening our house," he said. More statement than question. Zoe, I need you to keep every piece of paper, every message, every screenshot. I'm going to need it when I get home. I didn't fully register what "when I get home" meant yet. His deployment wasn't scheduled to end for months. But something in his voice told me plans were already shifting. That thousands of miles away, my brother was doing his own quiet calculations about timelines and priorities and what mattered most. Deborah escalated further, sending certified mail this time. An official-looking document with a fabricated case number claiming she'd filed a formal complaint with county code enforcement against our property for unauthorized modifications. The basketball hoop, installed with a permit 6 years earlier, buried somewhere in a box of old paperwork. We spent an entire weekend searching for that permit. Mom and I tearing through filing cabinets, increasingly desperate. I found it eventually, water-stained but legible, dated the summer I turned 11. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by rage at having to prove my right to exist in my own home. Other Ridgemont families started noticing the pattern too. The Okafors reached out quietly, sharing their own stack of unexplained fines. A retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson admitted Deborah had pressured her into signing a petition without fully explaining what it authorized. Slowly, isolated victims began recognizing each other across fence lines. I started a private group chat, just 5 families at first, sharing dates, screenshots, and notices. We called it Nothing Dramatic, just Ridgemont Neighbors. But it became the first real crack in Deborah's carefully maintained isolation of her targets. For the first time, we weren't fighting her one household at a time. Deborah noticed the sudden solidarity almost immediately, her instincts sharp despite her fabrications. She began holding informal coffee chats with select neighbors, subtly discouraging participation in what she called unproductive negativity. A few families, worried about their own standing, quietly withdrew. Fear, I was learning, spreads easier than solidarity. At school, a guidance counselor pulled me aside after noticing my grades slipping, my usual focus fraying at the edges. I didn't tell her everything, just enough. A difficult situation at home involving our HOA.
She nodded gently and said something I carried with me.
I hadn't given myself permission for that yet. I'd been so focused on staying calm, staying documented, staying the good victim that wouldn't give Deborah ammunition, that I'd buried how genuinely furious I was. That conversation cracked something open. I let myself cry in the school parking lot for the first time in weeks. Deborah's husband, Gary, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself, started appearing at our mailbox around the same time Mom checked it each evening. Never saying much, just watching. It unsettled Mom more than any of Deborah's letters had. "That's surveillance," she said flatly.
"That's not..."
I mentioned Gary's odd behavior to Deputy Reyes during one of his off-duty check-ins, and his expression shifted, careful and measured. "Keep documenting," he said again, then added something new. "I've heard some things about their household. Nothing I can act on yet. But I believe you, and I'm watching too." That small admission, "I believe you," meant more than I expected from someone in uniform who'd been friendly with Deborah for years. It told me the cracks in her carefully constructed authority were spreading beyond our little group chat, reaching people with actual power to eventually do something about it. August brought the fine deadline. And against everyone's advice, Mom refused to pay. "I'm not funding fraud," she said, jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of Marcus. Deborah responded by posting publicly that the Bennett family was non-compliant and a liability to community property values. The comments turned uglier. Someone in the Facebook group I'd never met wrote that certain people just don't understand how HOAs work, with a winking implication I understood perfectly. I screenshotted everything, hands trembling with a mixture of humiliation and something harder, sharper, gathering underneath it like a storm building strength before it breaks. Priya, furious on my behalf, wanted to post a public rebuttal immediately, laying out every documented lie. Her mother stopped her. "Not yet," she said. "You post prematurely." She reframes it as harassment against her. "Wait until you have enough that she can't spin it." Timing matters more than speed. That patience felt unbearable some days. Watching Deborah's narrative dominate the neighborhood conversation while we sat quietly building our case. But I trusted Priya's mother's instinct. And more than that, I trusted what Marcus kept telling me on our calls. Let her keep talking. Everything she says is more rope. Marcus's deployment updates grew vaguer that month. Less specific about return dates, more careful in tone. I didn't think much of it at the time, too consumed with our own local war to notice the quiet shift happening on his end. Thousands of miles away, decisions being made I knew nothing about. Deborah organized a town hall in the clubhouse in late August, presenting a slideshow about declining community standards. Photos of our house's supposedly overgrown lawn interspersed with stock images of graffiti and litter that had nothing to do with Ridgemont at all. The manipulation was almost impressive in its shamelessness. I sat in the back with Mom, forcing myself to stay silent, watching neighbors nod along to a presentation built on half-truths and outright fabrications. Mrs. I once gave a small, apologetic shrug. She'd signed that earlier petition. I understood, even as it still hurt to witness. After the meeting, Deputy Reyes approached us in the parking lot, speaking low. "I filed an internal note about tonight's presentation," he said. "Using stock photos to misrepresent a specific residence, if provable, could support a defamation claim. I'm not a lawyer, but I know people who are. Call this number." That number connected Mom to a legal aid clinic specializing in HOA disputes. A discovery that felt like the first real weapon in a fight we'd been absorbing blow after blow in. The intake attorney, a sharp woman named Ms. Koye, listened to our entire timeline without interrupting once. "This is fixable," she said finally.
Ms. move was requesting official HOA governance records from the county, formally, in writing, with our case number attached. Deborah couldn't dodge a legal records request the way she dodged neighborhood questions. The clock on her fabricated authority, quietly, invisibly, had just started running out.
September brought a new low. Someone spray-painted a slur on the Okafor's garage door, and Deborah, astonishingly, tried to imply on the group chat that it might have been an inside job to gain sympathy. The accusation was so grotesque that even her staunchest supporters went quiet for the first time. I watched that particular lie land wrong. Watched neighbors who'd defended her for months suddenly hesitate, recalculating. Cruelty toward an actual hate crime victim cracked something even sympathetic bystanders couldn't rationalize away. It wasn't enough to stop her, but it was the first visible dent in her armor.
And this request came back with confirmation. Ridgemont Estates HOA had been legally dissolved as an active governing body 2 years prior, due to lapsed filings, meaning Deborah's entire presidency, every fine, every notice, every fabricated authority, had been built on literally nothing. Nothing enforceable. Nothing real.
I read that confirmation letter 3 times, disbelief giving way slowly to something like vindication. 2 years. Neighborhood. Targeted families. Fabricated fines. All while representing an organization that legally didn't exist. Mom laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. Somewhere between relief and pure exhausted fury. We didn't go public immediately, Ms. Okoye cautioned patience, gathering enough documentation to make any denial impossible. But something had changed in me that week. I stopped flinching at slowed cars. I started shooting hoops in the driveway again, headphones out this time. I wanted her to see me. I wasn't hiding any. For a few weeks that September, Ridgemont felt almost normal again. Deborah, perhaps sensing the shifting mood after the Okafor incident, pulled back publicly. No new notices. No group chat sermons. Mom exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. I let myself believe, briefly, that the worst had passed. Priya and I spent a Saturday just being teenagers again. Thrifting downtown, arguing over movie choices, laughing until we couldn't breathe over something neither of us could later remember. It felt like reclaiming something Deborah had quietly stolen from me over the past year. The simple luxury of an ordinary afternoon. Marcus's calls grew warmer, more relaxed, though still oddly cagey about exact return dates. Soon, he kept saying, sooner than you think, with something in his voice I couldn't quite place. I chalked it up to military secrecy and didn't push. I was just grateful to hear him laugh again. The Ridgemont Neighbors group chat, now up to 11 households, started meeting occasionally in person. At Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table, sharing coffee and comparing notes without the pressure of Deborah's surveillance. It felt less like a war council and more like actual community, the kind Ridgemont was supposed to have been all along. Mrs. apologized formally for signing Deborah's earlier petition, explaining she'd been told it was simply a landscaping survey. Nobody blamed her. We were all learning. Was making manipulation feel reasonable in the moment, only revealing its true shape once you saw the pattern laid out.
Continued building the legal case quietly, requesting bank records tied to the HOA dues Deborah had been collecting despite having no legal authority to do so. The word, dues, made my stomach turn once I understood what it implied. Money changing hands, going somewhere, accountable to no one.
I went back to the community pool for the first time since summer. This time with the whole Ridgemont Neighbors kids crew. 6 of us splashing loudly, unapologetically, taking up space. Deborah's car passed once, slowed, then kept driving. I remember feeling, for a moment, genuinely powerful. It didn't last. School resumed its normal rhythm, and I found myself actually excited about junior year for the first time in a while. A new photography elective, a debate club Priya talked me into joining. Small ordinary joys, reclaimed one at a time, felt like acts of quiet defiance against everything Deborah represented. Mom started sleeping better. I noticed the permanent crease between her eyebrows softening slightly. She hummed while cooking again, something she used to do before the notices started, before the fines, before a neighbor's clipboard became a fixture of dread outside our windows. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that humming. Gary, Deborah's husband, stopped appearing at our mailbox, which felt like one more small mercy. Deputy Reyes mentioned, carefully, that there'd been some tension at the Whitfield house lately, though he wouldn't elaborate. I filed it away without much thought, too relieved by the quiet to interrogate its cause.
Scheduled a formal meeting with County Code Enforcement, requesting they officially notify all Ridgemont residents that no valid HOA existed, freeing everyone from Deborah's fabricated authority once and for all. The meeting was set for mid-October. I marked the date on my calendar, allowing myself real, cautious hope.
I even found myself, one evening, almost feeling sorry for Deborah, imagining what kind of loneliness or need for control drove someone to fabricate an entire identity around policing her neighbors. That sympathy evaporated fast the next week. But for a moment, I glimpsed the smallness underneath all her performance. Marcus's next call came at an unusual hour. Video connecting mid-afternoon instead of our usual Sunday slot. His background looked different. An airport, not a base. "Zoe," he said, grinning in a way I hadn't seen in over a year. "Don't tell Mom yet. I wanted you to know first." My hands went cold around the phone. "Know what?" I asked, though some part of me had already guessed. "I'm coming home early," he said. "Approved leave. Effective immediately. I'll be there in 4 days." I burst into tears right there in the kitchen, laughing and crying at the same time. I kept his secret exactly 1 day before Mom noticed my strange giddiness and pried it out of me over dinner. She cried too. The good kind of crying. The kind we hadn't done together in a long time. None of us knew yet that Marcus's timing would collide directly with Deborah's worst mistake. Deborah found out about the code enforcement meeting sooner than we expected. Mrs. Patterson later admitted a nervous neighbor had let it slip during small talk. Whatever calm we'd built over September vanished overnight. Deborah's SUV started appearing again. Slower, more deliberate, circling Willow Court like a shark scenting blood in water. A new flyer appeared on doors within days, warning residents that outside agitators were spreading false narratives about community leadership and urging everyone to stand united against baseless attacks. She never used my name, but the message was unmistakable, and this time it felt less careless, more calculated, more dangerous. I noticed her watching me specifically now, not just my house, lingering near the school bus stop some mornings, appearing at the grocery store the same afternoon I ran errands for Mom. Probably wasn't literal stalking, not yet, but it felt like being hunted by someone who'd decided I was the problem.
Extra caution. Recommending Mom and I avoid being alone in public spaces when possible and continue documenting every encounter meticulously. People backed into a corner get unpredictable, she warned. Especially people who've built their entire identity around control. Losing that control feels, to them, like losing everything.
That warning proved prophetic faster than any of us anticipated. On a Thursday in early October, I came home from debate club to find police cars in our driveway. Lights spinning silently. Mom standing on the lawn with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Pure, cold fear. Deborah had called the police, claiming she'd witnessed me stealing packages from neighbors' porches that afternoon, describing my appearance, my backpack, even the time down to the minute. I'd been in debate club until 4:30, with 12 witnesses and a sign-in sheet. She hadn't counted on an alibi that solid. Deputy Reyes arrived personally once he heard my name attached to the call, and I watched something shift in his professional demeanor, controlled frustration replacing routine procedure. "I need to speak with the reporting party directly," he told the responding officers, voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. My debate coach, Mrs. Chin, confirmed my alibi within minutes over the phone, her voice audibly furious on speaker. The sign-in sheet, time-stamped, photographed by 3 separate parents at pickup, made the accusation collapse instantly. Deborah, confronted with the evidence, claimed she'd made an honest mistake in the moment. An honest mistake that included a physical description matching me specifically, delivered with confident, detailed certainty. Deputy Reyes didn't buy it, and this time, he documented the entire interaction formally, adding it to a growing file that Ms. Okoye had already begun assembling for exactly this kind of pattern. Mom didn't cry that night. She sat very still at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that scared me more than tears would have. "This ends now," she said. "Whatever it takes." Her gets home to see it. I hadn't told her yet that Marcus was already on his way, that his flight would land in 3 days. Some instinct told me to keep that timeline close. A card held quietly, not because I didn't trust Mom, but because I wanted Deborah to have no idea what was coming. Priya's mother filed a formal complaint about the false police report on our behalf, and within Georgia's specific legal framework, knowingly filing a false report to law enforcement carried real criminal penalties. Deborah, for the first time, faced a consequence that couldn't be talked around with syrupy smiles and clipboards. She didn't back down, though. Cornered people rarely do gracefully. Instead, she posted a lengthy statement online painting herself as a persecuted community guardian, targeted by a coordinated smear campaign, tagging local news outlets, demanding sympathy from an audience that, slowly but surely, was beginning to see through her. A local reporter named Sarah Kim, intrigued by the dramatic framing, actually reached out to Deborah for an interview, and separately, to Ms. Okoye, who was more than happy to share the dissolved HOA records and the false police report timeline. Reporters, I was learning, love a story with real documentation. Deborah agreed to the interview, apparently confident in her own performance, unaware that Sarah Kim had already spoken with 3 other families, reviewed the Fairview Commons archive, and cross-referenced the community vote dates against a clubhouse maintenance schedule proving the building had been closed the entire supposed meeting day. While all this unfolded publicly, something quieter happened at the Whitfield house. Gary, Deborah's husband, called Ms. Okoye's office directly, voice barely above a whisper, asking to speak anonymously. He said he had documents. He said he'd known for a while. He said he was tired of staying silent. Gary's documents, delivered in a plain manila envelope left at the legal clinic's front desk. Included bank statements showing years of HOA dues deposited into a personal account, solely in Deborah's name, alongside handwritten notes cataloging targets she'd researched before each courtesy notice campaign, including background checks on specific families. My family's name appeared in those notes, dated months before the first basketball notice ever arrived, alongside a chilling annotation: military family, brother deployed, mother works nights, minimal adult presence, easy target. Reading that phrase later made something in me go cold, and then, immediately after, furiously, permanently hot.
An emergency meeting with Mom, Deputy Reyes, and the newly cooperating Deputy District Attorney's Office liaison, laying out the accumulated evidence, fraudulent authority, embezzled dues, a false police report, and now documented premeditation in target selection based partly, explicitly, on our family's specific vulnerabilities and race.
I wasn't in that meeting, but Mom told me about it afterward, her voice trembling with a mixture of vindication and horror. She researched us, Mom said. She picked us on purpose. Zoe. It was never random. Basketball hoop at all. It was about exactly who we are. That night, couldn't sleep, staring at my ceiling, replaying every notice, every slowed car, every syrupy sweetheart through a new lens. It hadn't been erratic overreach from an uptight neighbor. It had been calculated, researched, deliberate cruelty, dressed up in laminated badges and community concern. The realization sat heavy in my chest. Sarah Kim's article dropped 2 days later. Thoroughly sourced, meticulously fact-checked, laying out Deborah's fabricated authority, the dissolved HOA, the Fairview Commons pattern, and, thanks to Gary's documents, the targeted research behind her harassment campaigns. It spread through Ridgemont's group chats faster than any of Deborah's own posts ever had. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who'd stayed quiet, who'd nodded along at town halls, suddenly flooded the comments with their own stories, their own finds, their own unsettling encounters with Deborah's clipboard and false authority. The isolation she'd carefully maintained for years collapsed within a single afternoon online. Deborah didn't apologize. She doubled down instead, posting a rambling, increasingly incoherent rebuttal accusing Sarah Kim of biased journalism, accusing Gary of betrayal in a moment of marital difficulty, and accusing our family of orchestrating an elaborate fraud against her. Nobody believed her anymore. The performance had finally, completely, run out. County code enforcement, spurred by the sudden public attention, moved up their scheduled meeting to that Friday, announcing publicly that Ridgemont Estates had no valid governing HOA and that Deborah Whitfield held zero legal authority to issue fines, notices, or restrictions of any kind. It was official now. Documented. I felt something loosen in my chest reading that announcement, a tightness I'd carried for over a year finally beginning to release. But MS. Fight wasn't finished. A woman capable of the calculation revealed in Gary's documents wouldn't simply accept public humiliation and quietly disappear. She was right. The same day the county announcement went public, Deborah's car appeared outside our house again. But something about it felt different this time. Faster. Sharper. her movements jerky as she got out. No clipboard. No badge. Just raw, unmasked fury written across her face. I was alone in the driveway, ball in hand, when she approached, and for the first time in 18 months, I felt genuinely, physically afraid of this woman standing in front of me, stripped of every pretense she'd hidden behind. "You ruined my life," she said. "You and your whole family." "I didn't ruin anything," I said, voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "You did this to yourself." Her face contorted, and she stepped closer, close enough that I backed toward my own front door, heart hammering, suddenly very aware of exactly how isolated our quiet street actually was at that moment. "You people always think you're victims," she hissed. And there it was, finally, stripped of every euphemism she'd used for a year and a half, the thing underneath the clipboard, underneath the badge, underneath every calculated notice. I stood frozen, ball still clutched against my chest like a shield. A car pulled into the driveway behind her, fast, tires crunching gravel, and Deborah spun around, startled. I looked past her and felt my knees nearly buckle with relief. Marcus stepped out of the rental car, still in his travel clothes, having come straight from the airport without even stopping home first. He didn't run. Deliberate, measured, the kind of controlled movement I recognized from every video call he'd made over the past year, the posture of someone trained to assess a situation fully before acting. "Ma'am," he said, voice level but carrying an authority Deborah's fake badge had never possessed. "Step back from my sister." Deborah's face cycled through several expressions fast. Shock, recalculation, an attempt at her usual syrupy composure that crumbled almost instantly under Marcus's unflinching stare. "This doesn't concern you," she started. But Marcus was already between us. Solid, calm, immovable in a way that made her voice trail off mid-sentence. "It concerns me completely," he said. "I've read everything. The notes with our family's name on them. Deputy Reyes has too. And in about 10 minutes, so will everyone else standing on this street. Because I called ahead before I even landed." Deborah's face went genuinely, visibly pale. Neighbors began emerging onto porches, drawn by raised voices and the unmistakable sight of a uniformed-looking figure. Marcus still wore parts of his travel uniform, standing protectively in front of me. Deborah, suddenly aware of her audience multiplying by the second, tried one last pivot, one last performance. "I was simply trying to protect this community," she said, voice pitched for the gathering crowd, and for a moment I almost admired the sheer persistence of her delusion. The way she kept reaching for the same script even as it visibly failed in real time, right in front of everyone. "You researched us," Marcus said, cutting through her performance with quiet, devastating precision. "You picked us because you thought a military family with a single working mother and a teenage girl would be easy. You were wrong." His voice never rose. "It didn't need to." A verdict. Deputy Reyes arrived moments later, having indeed been called ahead. And this time he wasn't there to smooth things over or extend professional courtesy. He was there with a printed copy of the false police report charge, the embezzlement referral to the county, and a straightforward request that Deborah accompany him downtown. "You can't do this to me," Deborah said, voice cracking for the first time I'd ever heard. All performance finally, completely stripped away. I've lived here for years. I built this community. Nobody on that lawn, not one single neighbor watching, offered her a single word of support or sympathy. Gary appeared then too, walking slowly from their house, not to defend her but to stand quietly beside Ms. Koye, who'd arrived alongside Marcus after his call from the airport. "I'm done covering for this," Gary said softly, not looking at his wife. "I should have said something years ago." Deborah's initial detention wasn't dramatic. No handcuffs on our lawn. Just a quiet request to accompany Deputy Reyes to answer questions about the false police report and the county's fraud referral. But the quietness of it felt, somehow, more satisfying than any dramatic scene could have. Just consequences, finally, plainly arriving. As she walked to the patrol car, Deborah turned back once, searching the crowd for any flicker of the sympathy she'd always assumed was owed to her. She found none. Patterson looked away. The Okafors stood with their arms crossed. Even the neighbors who'd once nodded along now offered only silence. I stood on my own lawn, my brother's arm around my shoulders, watching a year and a half of fear and documentation and swallowed fury dissolve into something I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, but a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that comes after finally setting down a weight you'd carried too long. Mom came running from inside, having watched part of it through the window, and pulled both of us into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "You're home," she kept saying to Marcus, over and over, like she needed to confirm it was real. "You're actually home." That evening, Sarah Kim's follow-up article went live within hours. Headline blunt and unambiguous. Fraudulent HOA leader detained following false police report and fraud investigation. The comments section, once full of Deborah's defenders, now overflowed with residents sharing their own stories, finally unafraid to speak without her watching over them. The investigation, once it properly began, uncovered even more than Gary's initial documents suggested. Nearly $40,000 collected in fabricated dues over 2 years, spread across multiple households who'd paid out of fear or misplaced trust in a woman who'd never held any legitimate authority over any of them. Fairview Commons, Deborah's previous target community, reopened its own dormant complaints once news of the Ridgemont case reached them. The original family she'd driven out years earlier finally coming forward publicly, no longer alone in a story that had once seemed too strange, too specific, for anyone to believe them. I learned later that Marcus's early return leave hadn't been a coincidence at all. He'd been quietly working with his commanding officer for weeks,
using every piece of documentation Mom and I had sent him to build a case for emergency family leave, timed deliberately around the county meeting he knew was coming.
"I wasn't going to let you two handle this alone anymore," he told me that night, sitting on the edge of my bed like he used to when I was small and scared of thunderstorms. "You handled more than you should have had to. That's over now." The following weeks brought a strange, welcome quiet to Willow Court. No clipboards, no slowed cars, no laminated badges glinting in the afternoon sun. I shot hoops in the driveway every day after school, headphones out, unafraid, reclaiming a small ordinary ritual that had once cost me so much peace. The Ridgemont Neighbors Group, now numbering over 20 households, transformed into an actual, properly elected interim HOA committee, with real bylaws, real votes, and real accountability. Mrs. Patterson, somewhat to her own surprise, elected as temporary chair, determined that nothing like Deborah's reign would ever happen again. Deborah faced formal charges eventually: fraud, filing a false police report, and impersonating a community safety official. The fraud charges alone, given the documented amount and the number of victims, carried serious potential consequences, though the exact sentencing would ultimately rest with the court's decision. I testified once at a preliminary hearing, describing 18 months of notices and fines and slowed cars and a phone call that nearly turned a basketball game into something far worse. My voice shook at first, but Marcus sat directly behind me the entire time, and somehow that steadied everything. Deborah didn't look at me once during that hearing. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, the laminated badge long since confiscated as evidence, sitting in a sealed bag somewhere in a county storage room, finally stripped of whatever power she'd once convinced an entire neighborhood it actually held. Deborah made bail within 48 hours, her family posting the modest bond required for a first-time fraud arrest. This was likely that pretrial release was standard even in serious cases, but it did nothing to calm the unease that settled over Willow Court once she returned home. Gary moved out that same week, unable to stay in a house with a woman who'd apparently stopped speaking to him entirely, viewing his cooperation with authorities as the ultimate betrayal. Deborah, alone now in that house 3 doors down, seemed to unravel further with each passing day, her isolation feeding something darker. The county's interim HOA committee formally stripped Deborah of any remaining informal influence, removing her from every neighborhood platform, every group chat, every mailing list she'd once controlled. Losing that platform, the very thing she'd built her entire fabricated identity around, seemed to push her toward something more reckless entirely. Marcus, using his extended leave, started walking me to and from the bus stop each morning, not because I asked him to, but because I could tell he needed the reassurance of proximity as much as I did. Neither of us said it aloud. We didn't need to, either of us. Late one night, our home security camera, installed the week after the false police report, another expense we hadn't been able to easily afford, caught Deborah's SUV idling outside our house for nearly 20 minutes at 2 a.m., headlights off, engine running, before finally pulling away without approaching.
The footage immediately to the growing case file, and Deputy Reyes confirmed that idling outside a witness's home at that hour, given the pending charges, likely violated the conditions of her bail release. A judge issued a formal warning, the first tangible restriction placed directly on Deborah's movements.
She ignored it within days. A for sale sign appeared, illegally, staked into our front lawn overnight. Our actual phone number altered by 1 digit and printed beneath it, generating a flood of confused calls from strangers asking about a house we had absolutely no intention of selling. Petty. Deliberate. Marcus filmed the sign's removal himself, time-stamped, and delivered the footage directly to Ms. Okoye's office that same morning. Small acts like this, individually almost laughable, were building an unmistakable pattern of continued harassment even after arrest, even after public exposure, even after losing everything she'd once controlled in Ridgemont. I started having nightmares again, the first in weeks, waking gasping about clipboards and slowed cars and a voice on the phone describing a threat that had never existed. Mom found a therapist through MS. Okoye's clinic, who specialized in harassment-related trauma, and I started weekly sessions, slowly learning to name what I'd survived. Priya's family offered for me to stay over more often during that tense stretch, and I accepted more than I probably needed to, grateful for a house on a different street where Deborah's silhouette wasn't a constant possibility at the edge of every window. Marcus never complained about the extra distance driving me there. Deborah's behavior escalated further when she showed up, uninvited, at the County Code Enforcement Office, attempting to file a counter-complaint claiming Marcus had threatened her physically during their confrontation on our lawn. The office, already fully briefed on the case, dismissed it immediately, noting 3 separate witness accounts contradicting her claim entirely. That fabricated countercomplaint, once discovered, became its own small piece of evidence, a pattern of continued dishonesty even under active investigation, even facing real legal consequences. MS. Consciousness of guilt masquerading as victimhood, a phrase I found myself repeating to Priya more than once that week. One afternoon, I found a note tucked into our mailbox, and signed, block letters clearly disguised, "You'll regret testifying." Mom called Deputy Reyes immediately, and though the note couldn't be definitively traced, it violated her bail conditions regardless, given the obvious context and timing. A judge issued a stricter no-contact order that same week. Marcus barely left my side after that note arrived, and I noticed him doing something I recognized from his military training even without him explaining it, checking sight lines, noting exits, positioning himself between me and open windows without seeming to think about it consciously. I didn't feel scared with him there. I felt guarded. Deborah, now legally barred from approaching within 500 feet of our home, resorted to something almost pitiable in its desperation, mailing letters to my school, anonymously at first, then under her own name once the anonymous ones were traced, alleging I'd been coached to lie about our entire history together. My school's administration, having already been briefed by the guidance counselor months earlier, handled it with more grace than I expected, quietly confirming the letters, violated no policy that required action against me while noting them for their own records, should Deborah's harassment ever extend further into my educational environment. The whistleblower family from Fairview Commons, emboldened by everything unfolding publicly in Ridgemont, filed their own delayed police report about their original 2021 experience, adding another documented instance to a pattern now spanning at least 2 communities and multiple years of calculated race-based harassment dressed up as community concern. Sarah Kim's reporting expanded into a longer feature piece, tracing Deborah's pattern across both neighborhoods, interviewing former Fairview Commons residents who described nearly identical tactics, fabricated authority, targeted fines, false police reports, suggesting this wasn't erratic behavior at all, but a practiced, repeatable method refined over years. Reading that feature, I felt something settle in me that I hadn't expected. Not just anger anymore, but a strange, clarifying grief for every family before. Mine who'd endured this without the resources, the timing, or the family support that had ultimately allowed us to fight back and actually be believed. Deborah, increasingly isolated and facing mounting legal pressure, made her most dangerous move yet on a Tuesday evening in late October. She approached Priya, alone, walking home from the bus stop 2 streets over, attempting to pressure her into signing a statement recanting details she'd witnessed at the pool incident months earlier. Priya, to her enormous credit, recorded the entire interaction on her phone without Deborah noticing, capturing clear audio of witness tampering that violated not just Deborah's bail conditions, but constituted an entirely new criminal charge. She called her mother immediately afterward, shaking but composed, and then called me. That recording became, in Ms. Okoye's words, the nail in the coffin, undeniable evidence of continued intimidation against a minor witness, delivered in Deborah's own voice, time-stamped, unambiguous. The judge revoked her bail entirely within 48 hours. And this time, Deborah didn't walk out of the courthouse. She was taken into custody. I felt an enormous, complicated relief hearing that news, tangled up with anger that it had taken witness tampering against my best friend to finally, fully remove Deborah from our daily lives. Priya brushed off my apologies fiercely. I'm not sorry I recorded her, she said.
I'm glad I...
With Deborah now held without bail pending trial, an unfamiliar stillness settled permanently over Willow Court, different from the fragile calm of September. This felt earned, structural, real, not a lull before another storm, but the actual, hard-won beginning of something like genuine safety returning to our small corner of Ridgemont. Marcus's leave was extended once more, his commanding officer apparently sympathetic to the unfolding legal situation and the ongoing need for family support through what promised to be a lengthy trial process. He started looking into local jobs, quietly, without telling Mom directly, testing the idea of staying closer to home for good. I asked him about it directly one evening, and he admitted he'd been considering it even before any of this happened, that watching Mom and me navigate Deborah's campaign alone from thousands of miles away had crystallized something he'd been circling for a while. Some things matter more than deployment orders, he said simply. The investigation into Deborah's finances deepened further, uncovering not just the fabricated HOA dues but a similar, smaller scheme run under a different name years earlier in a third community, predating even Fairview Commons, evidence suggesting a pattern stretching back nearly a decade, refined and repeated across multiple states. Sarah Kim's article, now syndicated regionally, prompted several more former victims to come forward, each account distinct in its specifics but eerily consistent in its shape. Fabricated authority, targeted families, financial extraction, and an unshakable, performative certainty that made victims doubt their own perception of events for months at a time. I started, slowly, sharing my own account publicly for the first time, agreeing to a brief interview with Sarah Kim about my experience specifically as a minor targeted by an adult wielding fake authority. I spoke carefully, factually, the way Ms. Okoye had coached me, letting the documented timeline speak for itself. The response to my interview surprised me. Messages from teenagers in other states describing similar experiences with adults who'd used official-sounding titles to intimidate them, thanking me for putting language to something they hadn't known how to name. I hadn't expected to become anyone's example of anything. Felt strange and oddly meaningful. Winter approached, and with it, The trial date finally arrived on the court calendar mid-January, roughly 9 months after that first ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Deborah's SUV had rolled slowly to a stop outside our driveway. 9 months that had reshaped, in ways large and small, almost everything about our family's daily life.
And prepared us thoroughly for what testifying at an actual trial would involve. Different and more formal than the preliminary hearing months earlier. I practiced answering difficult questions in front of Mom and Marcus, my voice steadying with each rehearsal, anger transforming slowly into something more useful, clarity, precision, resolve.
Deborah's defense attorney, a tired-looking man clearly working with limited material, attempted a plea deal in December, offering reduced charges in exchange for a guilty plea and avoiding trial entirely. The county prosecutor, backed by the sheer volume of documented evidence, declined. This case, she said, deserved a full public accounting. I felt grateful for that decision, even knowing it meant more months of waiting, more months of preparation, more months of my own testimony hanging over the horizon. Some kinds of harm, I was learning, needed to be named fully and publicly, not quietly settled away in a plea deal nobody outside the courtroom would ever hear about. Christmas that year felt different from the quiet, worried holiday of the previous December. Marcus stayed home this time. No deployment pulling him away. No video call static separating us across time zones. We decorated the house together, all three of us. String lights wrapped around a porch that had once felt like a battlefield. Priya's family joined us for part of the holiday, and at one point, watching everyone laugh together in our small, crowded living room, I caught myself thinking that Deborah, sitting somewhere in a county detention facility, had genuinely believed she could erase people like us from feeling this kind of belonging. She'd failed completely. The interim HOA committee, now fully legitimized through proper elections, used the winter to draft real bylaws, real fee structures, real accountability measures, determined that Ridgemont would never again be vulnerable to a single unchecked individual claiming authority nobody had actually granted them. Mrs. Every meeting with quiet, careful thoroughness. I found myself, unexpectedly, joining that committee as a junior advisory member, the youngest person to ever hold any formal role in Ridgemont's governance. It felt like reclaiming something specific, not just safety, but voice. A seat at exactly the kind of table Deborah had once told me, explicitly, wasn't my concern. January arrived cold and clear. The trial date finally, undeniably close. I barely slept the week before, running through Ms. Okoye's coaching in my head, imagining the courtroom, imagining Deborah's face across the room, imagining finally speaking every truth I'd swallowed for the better part of a year and a half. Marcus drove me to the courthouse himself on the first day, parking early, walking me through the metal detectors with a steadiness I tried to absorb through simple proximity. "You've already survived the hardest part," he told me in the hallway outside the courtroom.
This is just telling.
Mom held my hand until the moment I was called forward, her grip firm, grounding, exactly the kind of quiet strength that had carried our small family through 18 months most people would never have to imagine surviving. I squeezed back once, took a breath, and walked toward the witness stand alone. The courtroom was fuller than I expected. Ridgemont neighbors filling several rows, Sarah Kim seated near the back with her notepad. The Fairview Commons family present too. Having traveled 2 hours specifically to watch a woman who'd once destroyed their sense of safety finally, formally, face a public reckoning for everything. The prosecutor, a measured woman named Ms. Alvarado, began gently, walking me through the basic timeline, how long we'd lived in Ridgemont, when the notices began, what the basketball incident actually looked like compared to what Deborah had described to police. My voice shook only slightly. I kept my eyes on the jury. I described the pool incident next. The humiliation of being interrogated for residency I'd held for 9 years. Watching sunbathing neighbors witness a 17-year-old treated as a trespasser in her own community. Several jurors' expressions shifted visibly during that testimony. Something like recognition, or perhaps discomfort, crossing more than one face.
Ms. walked me through the false theft accusation last. The police cars in our driveway. The alibi that had saved me from something far worse than embarrassment. If you hadn't been at the bait club that afternoon, she asked carefully, what do you believe would have happened? I answered honestly. Uncertainty felt worse than any specific fear.
The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted, predictably, to paint me as an unreliable narrator, asking whether I'd ever raised my voice at Deborah, whether I'd ever felt understandably frustrated enough to exaggerate details. I answered each question calmly, factually, refusing to let his framing rewrite a timeline documented meticulously in Mom's notebook. Isn't it true, he pressed, that teenagers sometimes misinterpret adult authority as harassment? I paused before answering, remembering Ms. Okoye's coaching to stay measured. I misinterpreted nothing, I said. She had no authority. Interpretation. That's a documented fact from the county. A few jurors nodded, almost imperceptibly. Deputy Reyes testified next, methodical and clear, laying out the timeline of false reports, the fabricated badge, the pattern he'd personally observed shift from petty enforcement to genuine danger over 18 months. His professional credibility, built over years of community service, lent weight the defense struggled visibly to undermine on cross-examination. Gary testified reluctantly but honestly, describing years of watching his wife construct an identity around fabricated authority, admitting his own complicity in staying silent far too long. I should have said something after Fairview Commons, he said quietly. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. I was wrong, and people got hurt. The Fairview Commons family's testimony landed with particular weight, describing an almost identical pattern years earlier and 1,000 miles away. Proof this wasn't a single lapse in judgment but a deliberate, repeatable method Deborah had refined and reused, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood whenever consequences finally caught up with her. Priya testified about the witness tampering incident, playing the recorded audio for the courtroom, Deborah's own voice filling the room with a clarity that left little room for the defense's attempted reframing. I watched several jurors close their eyes briefly during playback, absorbing the unmistakable tone of calculated intimidation.
Ms. presented Gary's financial documents next, walking the jury through nearly $40,000 in fabricated dues, bank statements showing the money moving into personal accounts, spreadsheets Deborah had apparently kept meticulously, tracking which families paid readily and which required additional pressure to comply with fictional obligations.
The targeting notes were presented last among the financial evidence. My family's name highlighted among several others. The annotation about our minimal adult presence and military deployment read aloud in the courtroom. I watched Mom's hands tighten in her lap, watched Marcus's jaw set, watched Deborah stare fixedly at the table before her. The defense's own case felt thin by comparison. Calling only a handful of witnesses, former Ridgemont residents who described Deborah as generally pleasant, community-minded, perhaps overzealous but never malicious. Under cross-examination, most admitted they'd never personally received a fine or notice, undermining their own testimony's relevance to the specific charges at hand. Deborah herself took the stand in her own defense, and I watched her attempt one final performance. Tearful, wounded, describing herself as a woman who'd simply wanted to make her community better, whose good intentions had been twisted by people looking for someone to blame for their own problems. Nobody in the room seemed moved.
Cross-examination dismantled that performance methodically, question by question, contrasting Deborah's claimed intentions against her own documented notes, her own bank statements, her own recorded voice pressuring a minor witness to recant sworn testimony. Deborah's composure cracked visibly under the accumulated weight of her own evidence.
You wrote easy target about a military family. MS. Alvarado said, voice steady, unhurried. Does that sound like community-mindedness to you? Deborah had no real answer. Just a long, uncomfortable silence that stretched across the courtroom, more damning than any objection her attorney could have raised in that moment. I watched the jury's faces during that silence, and something in me finally, fully believed we might actually win this, not just legally, though that mattered enormously, but in the deeper sense of being seen accurately. Our experience validated by 12 strangers weighing evidence without the distorting lens Deborah had maintained for years. Closing arguments began the following morning. MS. Alvarado walking the jury methodically back through every piece of evidence. The false authority, the false police report, the embezzled dues, the witness tampering, the documented targeting notes, building a picture not of an overzealous neighbor but of calculated, sustained, race-motivated fraud. The defense attorney's closing felt increasingly desperate, leaning heavily on Deborah's genuine belief in her own authority as some kind of mitigating factor, an argument that seemed to convince nobody, not even from his own body language, the attorney making it. I felt Mom's hand find mine again, steady, waiting. The judge's instructions to the jury took nearly 40 minutes, careful and thorough, outlining each specific charge and the evidence required to support conviction. I barely absorbed the legal language, too focused on watching the jury's faces, searching for any hint of how 18 months of documented harassment might finally resolve. Deliberation began that afternoon, and the waiting felt somehow harder than the testimony itself had been. We sat in the courthouse hallway for hours, Marcus pacing occasionally, Mom flipping through her worn incident notebook one more time, as if reviewing it again might somehow influence 12 strangers deliberating behind closed doors. Sarah Kim found us during the wait, offering quiet, professional reassurance without overstepping. She'd covered enough cases, she said, to recognize when evidence this thorough tended to land clearly with juries. It didn't guarantee anything, but it helped. Hearing someone outside our family express cautious confidence in what we'd built together. Priya arrived after school let out, sitting beside me in the hallway without saying much, just present, the way good friends know how to be during unbearable waiting. I thought about everything the past 18 months had cost both of us, her recorded confrontation, my swallowed fear, all of it converging toward this single afternoon. The first day of deliberation ended without a verdict, and we drove home in near silence, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. I barely slept, imagining every possible outcome, unable to fully believe that after everything, a verdict still rested on 12 strangers I'd never speak to directly. The second morning brought us back to the same hallway, the same uncomfortable chairs, the same restless waiting. Around noon, word came that the jury had a question for the judge, something about the financial records timeline. MS seemed encouraged by the specificity of it. I tried not to read too much into anything. Gary sat several seats away from us in the hallway, alone, having testified against his own wife and now waiting, presumably, for the same resolution we were, though for entirely different reasons. I caught his eye once. Tired nod. Something between apology and solidarity. I nodded back. The Fairview Commons family stayed too, despite having traveled 2 hours and having no direct financial stake in a Ridgemont verdict. We need to see this through, the mother told me quietly. For us too, even years later. Some things you carry until someone finally says out loud that it mattered. I thought about that phrase for a long time afterward, carrying something until someone says it mattered. I realized I'd been doing exactly that for 18 months, carrying documented fear and swallowed anger, waiting for some external validation that what happened to us had actually been real, actually been wrong, actually mattered. Late that second afternoon, word finally came that the jury had reached a verdict. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore and everything to do with the sheer, overwhelming weight of finally, actually arriving at the moment I'd spent a year and a half building toward. We filed back into the courtroom. Mom on one side, Marcus on the other, Priya and her mother directly behind us. Deborah sat at the defense table, pale, hands folded tightly, none of her usual performance visible anymore. Just a woman waiting, finally, for consequences she'd spent years successfully avoiding elsewhere. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict on all counts. The forewoman stood, holding a single folded paper, and for a moment the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath collectively. 18 months of documented harassment, fabricated authority, and calculated cruelty balanced on the edge of a single sentence. I gripped Marcus's hand on one side and Mom's on the other, feeling my own pulse in my throat, aware suddenly of every sound in the room, the rustle of paper, the judge clearing his throat, Deborah's shallow, audible breathing from across the courtroom. Nobody moved. The moment stretched impossibly long. On the charge of filing a false police report, the forewoman began, and I felt Marcus's grip tighten almost imperceptibly beside me, both of us leaning forward slightly, as if physical proximity to the words themselves might somehow make them arrive faster, might somehow make 18 months of waiting finally, mercifully end. I closed my eyes for just a moment before the verdict came, thinking of that first ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a basketball echoing against a backboard, A woman with a fake badge stepping out of her SUV. And everything that single afternoon had eventually, inevitably, led all of us to in this quiet, waiting courtroom. Guilty, the forewoman said, and the word landed in the courtroom like something physical, a weight lifting and settling all at once. Guilty on the false police report. Guilty on fraud. Guilty, count after count, until every single charge against Deborah Whitfield had been formally, unanimously affirmed. I felt Mom exhale beside me, a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, and Marcus's arm came around my shoulders immediately, solid and steady. Behind us, I heard Priya's mother whisper something to her daughter, and further back, quiet applause rippled briefly before the judge called for order in the courtroom. Deborah's composure, already thin, shattered completely. She stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor, and for one startling moment I thought she might actually lunge toward the prosecution table. Her attorney grabbed her arm, murmuring urgently, but she shook him off, voice rising into something raw and unrecognizable. "This is a conspiracy," she shouted, spinning to face the gallery, eyes wild, searching for anyone who might still believe her. "You're all going to regret this. Every single one of you." Ordering her to sit, warning of contempt charges if the outburst continued another second. Two bailiffs moved toward her, and something in that moment, the physical reality of consequence finally, undeniably arriving, seemed to break whatever remained of her composure entirely. She sagged suddenly, all the fury draining out at once, replaced by something smaller, more hollow, more genuinely afraid than I'd ever seen her. I watched her being led toward a side door, glancing back once toward Gary, who looked away deliberately, refusing to meet her eyes. That refusal, small as it was, felt like its own quiet verdict, a marriage's final ending playing out in the margins of a much larger public reckoning. The courtroom slowly emptied into the hallway, neighbors hugging each other, Sarah Kim already typing rapidly on her phone, the Fairview Commons mother crying openly, gripping her husband's hand. Mrs. Specifically, taking both my hands in hers. "You were so brave," she said.
"I should have believed you."
I didn't have it in me to hold onto old resentment in that moment, not with relief flooding every part of me. "You believe me now," I told her, and meant it. That was enough. Fighting this neighborhood through fear and isolation, watching it come back together felt like its own quiet victory.
And our family in the hallway, professional but visibly pleased, explaining that sentencing would be scheduled for several weeks out, allowing time for victim impact statements to be prepared formally. "You'll have the chance to speak directly, if you want to," she told me. "Some people find it helps. Others don't need to."
I knew immediately I wanted to speak. 18 months of swallowed words, of documented incidents, of careful, measured testimony designed to withstand cross-examination. I wanted, finally, one moment to speak plainly, without strategy, without careful legal framing, just the truth of what those months had actually cost me personally. Marcus drove us home that evening in a comfortable, exhausted silence, the radio playing low, streetlights sliding past the windows. When we pulled onto Willow Court, our actual street looked exactly the same as it always had. Same houses, same trees, same driveway basketball hoop. Felt different now. Genuinely ours again. Neighbors had left small things on our porch by the time we got home. A bouquet from the Okafors, card from Mrs. Patterson, a plate of cookies from a family I barely knew who'd apparently been quietly following the case online. Small gestures, but they landed with real weight after so long feeling isolated. That night, Mom made a full dinner for the first time in weeks. Not takeout, not something rushed between shifts. An actual meal. All three of us at the table together. Marcus told stories from deployment he'd never shared over video calls. Small funny moments he'd been saving, and I laughed until my ribs hurt. I slept better that night than I had in over a year. No nightmares about clipboards or slowed cars. Just deep, uninterrupted rest. Waking the next morning felt almost strange. Adjusting to the absence of a specific, constant low-grade dread I'd carried for so long I'd nearly forgotten what its absence felt like. News of the verdict spread beyond Ridgemont within days. Sarah Kim's follow-up piece picked up by regional outlets. Then, briefly, by a national news segment focused on HOA fraud and impersonation cases. I declined interview requests mostly, choosing instead to write my own short statement, careful and considered, published through Ms. Okoye's clinic. In that statement, I tried to capture something beyond just Deborah's specific fabrications, the broader pattern of how fake authority, dressed up convincingly enough, can terrorize a family for months before anyone with actual power intervenes. I wrote about believing yourself, even when an entire neighborhood seems arranged against that belief. The response surprised me again. Messages from strangers describing their own experiences with fake authority figures, some involving HOAs, others workplaces, schools, landlords, the same underlying dynamic repeating across contexts I'd never considered. I hadn't set out to become a voice for anything larger. Found me anyway, gradually, unexpectedly. Weeks passed as sentencing approached, and I spent evenings drafting and redrafting my victim impact statement with Ms. Okoye's gentle guidance, trying to balance honesty with restraint, trying to name exactly what those 18 months had cost without collapsing into pure anger that might undercut the careful case we'd built. Marcus made his decision official during that stretch, formally requesting separation from active duty, choosing a reserve status that would let him stay close to home permanently. "I've done my service," he told Mom over dinner one night. "Now I want to do this, be here, actually here, for whatever comes next." Mom cried at that announcement too, though these tears carried a different weight than the fear-soaked ones of the past year. "You don't have to do that for us," she said. Marcus just shook his head. "I'm not doing it for you. This is what matters to me now." The interim HOA committee, fully legitimized by that point, invited me to help draft new bylaws specifically addressing what had happened, clear limits on volunteer authority, mandatory election transparency, formal complaint procedures that couldn't be weaponized the way Deborah had weaponized her fabricated position for years without any real check on her power. I found something genuinely healing in that work, transforming what had happened to me into structural protection for whoever might live on Willow Court after my family eventually moved on. It wouldn't undo 18 months of fear, but it might prevent someone else's 18 months from ever happening the same way again. Sentencing day arrived on a bright, cold morning in early March, almost a full year after that first basketball afternoon. The courthouse felt different this time, less charged with uncertainty. Everyone present already knowing the verdict, waiting instead to hear what actual consequences would finally, formally attach themselves to Deborah's documented pattern of harm.
MS presented her sentencing recommendation first, walking the judge through the full scope of documented harm, financial fraud spanning multiple communities, false reports risking serious consequences for a minor, witness tampering, and a demonstrated pattern of racially targeted harassment refined and repeated across nearly a decade without intervention.
The judge invited victim impact statements next, and I watched several people I'd come to know over the past year step forward. Mrs. Patterson describing years of quiet manipulation. The Fairview Commons mother describing her family's forced relocation. Gary offering a brief, halting statement about complicity and long overdue accountability. When my turn came, I stood slowly, aware of Mom and Marcus watching from the gallery, aware of Deborah seated at the defense table, finally forced to simply listen without interrupting or performing. I unfolded my prepared statement, took a breath, and began speaking, my voice steadier than I'd expected it to be. I was 15 when the notices started, I said. I'm 17 now. Shaped by fear I shouldn't have had to carry, fear of playing basketball in my own driveway, fear of swimming in a pool I'd used my whole life, fear of a slowing car outside my window. I described the specific weight of being disbelieved, of watching neighbors nod along to fabricated slideshows, of learning that documented facts sometimes still weren't enough against a confident enough performance of authority. You made me doubt my own memory, I said, looking directly at Deborah for the first time. That's the part one won't forgive. Deborah stared back at me, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face that might have been genuine recognition of harm done, quickly replaced by the same defensive rigidity she'd worn throughout the trial. I didn't need her remorse. I'd stopped needing anything from her the day the jury spoke. I finished my statement by describing what had actually healed the fear, not the verdict alone, but the community rebuilding itself afterward. Neighbors comparing notes, a brother coming home, a committee drafting real protections. You tried to isolate us, I told her. You failed. Actually matters now. I sat back down to a courtroom so quiet I could hear my own pulse. Mom's hand finding mine immediately, Marcus's steady presence beside her. MS. Me a small, approving nod from the prosecution table. Even the judge paused a moment longer than procedurally necessary before calling the next portion of the hearing. The defense's final plea for leniency felt threadbare by that point. Citing Deborah's difficult personal circumstances and lack of prior formal convictions, an argument that conveniently ignored the Fairview Commons pattern and the additional third community's fraud, both entered into evidence weeks earlier as context for a sentencing decision. The judge, before announcing sentencing, addressed Deborah directly, his tone measured but unmistakably serious. You built an entire identity around authority you never possessed, he said, and used it to target a family specifically because you calculated they'd be vulnerable. That calculation, more than anything else, informs this court's decision today. I watched Deborah's face during that address, watched whatever remained of her composure finally, completely dissolve, replaced by something that looked almost like genuine shock, as though some part of her had truly believed, until that exact moment, that her performance might still somehow talk her out of real consequences. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in county detention, followed by 5 years probation, mandatory restitution to every documented victim including our family, a permanent restraining order, preventing any future HOA involvement anywhere in the state, and formal registration requirements given the demonstrated pattern of premeditated, targeted harassment across multiple households. 18 months. Time she'd spent terrorizing our family, though I doubted the symmetry was intentional. Still, something about that number landed with a strange, satisfying precision, as though the universe had, for once, arranged a consequence that actually matched the true scope of harm inflicted. Bailiffs led Deborah from the courtroom a final time, and this time, there was no dramatic outburst, no last performance for a gallery that had long since stopped watching for one. She simply walked, shoulders slumped, the fabricated confidence that had once commanded an entire neighborhood's fear finally, completely extinguished. The restitution order required her to repay every fabricated dues payment, every fraudulent fine, calculated precisely from Gary's meticulous bank records, nearly $40,000 total, distributed proportionally among affected Ridgemont families, plus additional damages awarded specifically to our family for the false police reports' documented psychological impact. Mom used part of the restitution, once it eventually arrived months later, to finally repair the porch light Deborah had once cited in a fabricated notice, replacing it with something warmer, more deliberately welcoming, a small act of reclamation that felt disproportionately meaningful given everything that single porch light had once represented. The Fairview Commons family received restitution too, years overdue, along with a formal apology entered into the court record, not from Deborah, who offered nothing resembling genuine remorse, but from the county acknowledging systemic failures that had allowed her pattern to continue unchecked across multiple communities for nearly a decade. Gary filed for divorce within weeks of the sentencing, citing irreconcilable differences that felt, to anyone who'd followed the case, almost comically understated. He sold the house on Willow Court that spring, moving somewhere quieter, somewhere without a reporter's phone number saved and a former wife's name attached to every local search. I ran into him once before he moved, at the grocery store, both of us startled by the unexpected encounter. "I'm sorry," he said simply. No elaboration needed. "For all of it." I nodded, accepting the apology without needing to fully forgive him for it. Some things just take time. The house itself sold quickly once listed, purchased by a young family with 2 small kids who had no idea, initially, about the property's recent history until a well-meaning neighbor filled them in over a welcome basket. They stayed anyway, seemingly undeterred, and within months their kids were riding bikes past our driveway like nothing had ever happened there. Sarah Kim's reporting eventually won a regional journalism award for the investigative series, and she credited the Ridgemont Neighbors group chat, in her acceptance remarks, as proof that communities willing to compare notes and document patiently can dismantle even the most confidently performed fabricated authority. I felt strange pride reading that quote. The county, prompted by the case's public attention, implemented new oversight requirements for HOA governance statewide, mandating regular verification of active board status and creating a formal complaint pathway specifically for fraudulent authority claims. MS. A small, real legacy of everything our family and others had endured. I returned to the community pool that summer without hesitation for the first time in over a year. Priya beside me, the water exactly as cool and ordinary as it had always been before Deborah ever weaponized it against me. No clipboard waited at the gate. No demand for proof I belonged there. Marcus took a job with a veterans support nonprofit that fall. Work that let him stay local while still serving in a way that felt meaningful to him. He coached my old basketball hoop into something better too, replacing the worn backboard, and we played together most evenings, no longer glancing anxiously toward Deborah's old house. I applied to colleges that year with an essay about the entire experience, not centered on victimhood but on what I'd learned about documentation, patience, and the specific power of communities that refuse to stay isolated from each other. Several admissions officers, I'd later learn, specifically mentioned that essay in my acceptance letters. Mrs. Still chairing the now fully legitimate HOA committee, organized an actual community picnic that August, the first genuine neighborhood gathering in years that wasn't shadowed by surveillance or fabricated notices. Families who'd once avoided each other out of fear compared stories openly, laughing at things that had once felt too dangerous to name aloud. I thought, standing in the middle of that picnic, about every quiet act of resistance that had built toward this ordinary, sunlit afternoon, a notebook full of dates, a lawyer who took our case seriously, a deputy who believed us, a best friend who recorded evidence at real personal risk, a brother who came home. The Fairview Commons family sent a card that fall, thanking our family specifically for finally, publicly, connecting their years-old experience to a pattern that authorities could no longer dismiss as isolated or exaggerated. You gave us back our own story, the mother wrote. We'd started to doubt it ourselves. Thank you for that. I kept that card, tucked inside Mom's original incident notebook, now more a keepsake than active evidence, a physical record of everything documented, endured, and eventually, thoroughly proven true. Some nights I still took it out, not out of lingering fear, but as a reminder of exactly how far we'd come together. Deputy Reyes stopped by occasionally, off-duty, checking in the way he had throughout the entire ordeal, though the visits felt different now, lighter, genuinely social rather than protective. You did good, kid, he told me once, watching me sink a three-pointer in the driveway.
Not many people your age.
I didn't feel particularly heroic most days, just tired in a way that had finally, mercifully, started to lift. MS asked if I'd be willing to speak occasionally to other teenagers navigating similar situations, and I agreed, cautiously, understanding now that my specific story might genuinely help someone else feel less alone. Priya and I stayed close through senior year. The friendship deepened rather than strained by everything we'd survived together. She mentioned once, almost offhand, that recording Deborah that day had been the scariest thing she'd ever done. I'd do it again in a heartbeat, she added.
You'd have done.
I believed her completely. More than almost anything else that came out of the whole ordeal, felt like the truest measure of what we'd actually gained. Not just legal vindication, but a tested, proven understanding of exactly who would show up when things got genuinely dangerous. That kind of knowledge doesn't fade. Marcus eventually met someone, a fellow veteran named Denise working at the same nonprofit, and watching my brother build an ordinary, hopeful life on the same street where he'd once stood protectively between his sister and a woman's unmasked fury felt like its own quiet, satisfying kind of justice, separate from anything the courts had decided. Mom, for her part, finally took an actual vacation that winter, a long weekend with an old nursing school friend, something she hadn't allowed herself in years of working double shifts and absorbing Deborah's relentless campaign largely alone before Marcus came home. She came back rested in a way I hadn't seen in years. I thought, sometimes, about the version of Deborah's plan that might have succeeded, if Gary had never spoken up, if Priya hadn't recorded that conversation, if Marcus's leave hadn't aligned exactly when it did, if a single deputy hadn't quietly decided to believe a 17-year-old over a woman with a laminated badge. So much of what saved us depended on people choosing, individually, to do the harder right thing instead of the easier convenient one, a lawyer who took a case without guaranteed payment, a reporter who fact-checked instead of chasing easy outrage, a husband who finally broke his own long silence. None of it was inevitable. All of it mattered. 2 years later, I left for college 3 states away. Marcus and Mom driving me up together. The same battered incident notebook packed carefully in a box of keepsakes I doubted I'd ever need again but couldn't bring myself to leave behind. Willow Court, in the rearview mirror, looked exactly like what it now was, home. Deborah served her full 18 months and, upon release, relocated out of state entirely, barred permanently from any HOA involvement. Her name flagged in a growing database Ridgemont's case had helped establish for exactly this kind of repeat offender. I heard, secondhand, that she tried once more in a new town. It didn't work. The database MS eventually caught her attempted repeat pattern within weeks. Local authorities alerted before she could establish the kind of fabricated authority that had once taken her years to build undetected in Ridgemont and Fairview Commons both. Some legacies, I learned, protect people you'll never personally meet. Gary remarried eventually, a quiet ceremony I only heard about through Mrs. Patterson's ever-reliable neighborhood grapevine. I hoped, genuinely, that he'd found something more honest the second time around. People contain multitudes, even the ones who stay silent too long before finally, belatedly, choosing to do the right thing. Ridgemont Estates thrived under its properly elected committee. Mrs. Patterson eventually handing leadership to a younger resident. The whole system running exactly the way community governance is actually supposed to: transparent, accountable, boring in the specific, wonderful way that safety often is once you've experienced its opposite for long enough. I still shoot hoops when I visit home during college breaks. Marcus occasionally joining, the sound echoing across a driveway that once represented 18 months of fear and now represents almost nothing at all beyond an ordinary basketball hoop on an ordinary street where an ordinary teenage girl finally gets to just be a kid. People sometimes ask if I'm angry, looking back, and the honest answer is complicated: grateful for who showed up, still occasionally furious about how close it came to going differently, and mostly just relieved that a fake badge, a laminated lie, And a woman's calculated cruelty didn't get the final word in my story. My brother likes to say the real twist was never Deborah's fake authority getting exposed. It was a family refusing to stay isolated, a community learning to compare notes, a 17-year-old girl believing her own documented truth even when an entire neighborhood initially chose comfortable denial over difficult accountability. Willow Court is quiet again these days. Genuinely quiet. The kind built on real safety instead of fabricated control. I think about that sometimes. Dribbling a basketball in the same driveway where it all started. Grateful for an ordinary life reclaimed one documented, defiant afternoon at a time.